In 1900, a man with 12 employees and a single factory in Akron, Ohio, decided he was going to put America on wheels. His name was Harvey Firestone, and for the next 7 decades, that is exactly what he did. Firestone Tire and Rubber Company didn't just make tires, it built the infrastructure that made the American automobile possible. Every Ford rolling off Henry Ford's assembly line rode on Firestone rubber. Every Indianapolis 500 winner that crossed the finish line did it on Firestone tires. Every truck that moved American goods across American highways in the post-war boom was sitting on Firestone. The company didn't sell a product, it held America up. At its peak, Firestone was one of the most powerful manufacturing companies on Earth. Factories in Akron running around the clock, thousands of workers, hundreds of millions in revenue, a brand name so embedded in American life that it appeared in living rooms every week. The Voice of Firestone, a nationally broadcast music program that ran for decades on radio and then television. Firestone wasn't just a tire company, it was an American institution. And then Japan came. Not with an army, not with a trade war, not with anything that showed up in newspapers as a threat. Japan came with a better tire. And Firestone, the company that had built an empire on rubber and ambition and the personal friendship between the two most powerful industrialists of the 20th century, didn't see it until it was already too late. This is the story of how Firestone lost everything, not in a single disaster, not in a single decision, but in a series of choices that made complete sense at the time and destroyed the company anyway. To understand what Firestone built, you have to understand Akron, Ohio in the early 1900s. They called it the rubber capital of the world. And that wasn't marketing, that was geography and chemistry and timing all arriving at the same moment. The Great Lakes gave Akron access to shipping routes, the railroad networks gave it access to raw materials, and the automobile, that new, terrifying, world-changing machine that was just beginning to appear on American roads, gave it a product that the entire country was going to need. Harvey Firestone understood this before almost anyone. He had started with wagon tires, solid, rubber, basic, unglamorous, but he was watching the automobile industry the way a hawk watches an open field. And when he met Henry Ford, when those two men sat across from each other and recognized in each other the same relentless, manufacturing-obsessed, America-building ambition, a deal was made that would define both companies for generations. Ford needed tires, Firestone would make them. In 1906, Henry Ford bought 2,000 sets of tires from Harvey Firestone. That transaction seems small. It wasn't. It was the beginning of a supply relationship that would scale alongside the most explosive manufacturing growth in American history. As Ford's Model T turned the automobile from a luxury into a necessity, Firestone's factories in Akron scaled with it. More cars meant more tires meant more workers meant more factories. By the 19-teens, Firestone was no longer a small operation running on ambition and a handshake deal. It was an industrial force. The Akron factories ran on multiple shifts. The production lines were among the most advanced in American manufacturing. Firestone engineers were constantly improving the process, how rubber was mixed, how tires were cured in their molds, how quality was maintained at the speeds the automobile industry was demanding. And Harvey Firestone himself was everywhere, at the factory, at the racetrack, at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where Firestone tires were competing and winning and building a reputation for performance that translated directly into consumer trust. If Firestone tires could survive the Indianapolis 500, they could survive anything.
The message. And it worked. By the 1920s, the Firestone name meant something beyond rubber. It meant American industrial confidence. It meant the belief that the best products in the world were made in the United States by American workers in American factories using American engineering. Harvey Firestone was friends with Henry Ford. He was friends with Thomas Edison. He camped with them in the summers, those famous camping trips that became cultural events. Photographs of the most powerful men in American industry sitting around fires in the wilderness, building the world. These weren't just friendships, they were alliances, and they placed Firestone at the absolute center of American industrial power during the most transformative period in manufacturing history. The company kept growing. Through the Depression, which hit hard, which forced adaptation, which required Firestone to find new markets like agricultural tires to survive, and through World War II, when American rubber production became a matter of national security and Firestone factories pivoted to military production, the company proved it could absorb disruption and come out stronger. By 1945, when the war ended and America entered its great post-war expansion, Firestone was positioned perfectly. The suburbs were being built. Americans were buying cars in numbers that had never been seen before. The highway system was coming. The trucking industry was exploding. Every single one of those vehicles needed tires. Firestone had the factories. Firestone had the workers. Firestone had the brand. For 20 years after World War II, the tire business in America was essentially a competition between giants who all knew each other, all operated from the same industrial base, and all competed on roughly the same terms. Firestone versus Goodyear, both based in Akron, both massive, both deeply embedded in the American automotive supply chain. It wasn't a comfortable competition, it was fierce. But it was a competition Firestone understood, a competition where the rules were clear, where the factories and the technology and the relationships were the playing field. Then, in the late 1960s, something arrived from Europe that nobody in Akron took seriously enough: the radial tire. This is the moment everything changed. And the tragedy of Firestone is that they saw it coming and still managed to get it catastrophically wrong. A radial tire is fundamentally different from the bias-ply tires that American manufacturers had been making for decades. In a bias-ply tire, the cords that give the tire its structure run diagonally across the tire at angles. It was the standard. It was what every American factory was built to produce. It was what every American car was designed to accept. A radial tire runs its cords perpendicular to the direction of travel, with a separate belt of steel cords under the tread. The result is a tire that runs cooler, lasts longer, handles better, and uses less fuel. It was, by almost every technical measure, a superior product. Michelin, the French tire company, had been developing and refining radial technology since the 1940s. By the late 1960s, radials were standard across Europe. European drivers knew the difference. European car manufacturers were designing their vehicles around radial tire performance. America was behind. Not because American engineers couldn't understand radials. They understood them perfectly. But because switching from bias-ply to radial production wasn't a formula change, it wasn't a small adjustment, it was a complete factory transformation. The equipment that built bias-ply tires could not build radials. The tooling was different, the curing process was different, the steel belt application required entirely new machinery. Converting an American tire factory to radial production meant tearing out existing equipment and replacing it, an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars across
Dozens of facilities. Goodyear made the decision to convert. It was painful and expensive, but they committed. Firestone hesitated. And in that hesitation, in the space between recognizing what needed to be done and actually doing it, the company made the decision that would eventually kill it. Firestone tried to find a middle path. They would build a radial tire,
but they would build it on modified bias ply equipment. They would retrofit existing machinery rather than replace it. They would get to market faster, spend less capital, and still have a product to offer dealers and automakers asking for radials. The tire was called the Firestone 500. It was introduced to the American market as Firestone's answer to the radial revolution. It was a catastrophe. The problem was physics. Radial tires require specific manufacturing tolerances that bias ply equipment simply cannot consistently maintain. The steel belts need to be applied with precision. The bonding between the tread and the tire body needs to be exact. The curing process needs to account for the different stress patterns or radial experiences under load. Firestone's modified equipment couldn't reliably deliver any of that. The Firestone 500 began failing on American roads. At highway speeds, the tread separated from the tire body. Not on every tire, not immediately, but enough, and in enough cases at high enough speeds that the failures were catastrophic. Blowouts, accidents, deaths. The National Highway Safety Traffic Administration launched an investigation. What they found inside Firestone's own documents was damning. Internal reports from as early as 1975 showed that Firestone engineers knew the 500 had problems. The company had internal data showing failure rates that should have triggered immediate action. Instead, Firestone blamed the consumer. Publicly, the company's position was that the failures were caused by underinflation and poor maintenance, that drivers weren't taking care of their tires properly, that the product was sound, and the problem was human error. This was not true, and the documents proved it wasn't true. In 1978, under enormous regulatory pressure and with public anger reaching a boiling point, Firestone recalled 14.5 million tires. 14.5 million tires. It was the largest tire recall in American history. The cost was staggering, not just financially, though the financial damage was severe, with annual losses reaching approximately $250 million and total debt exceeding $1 billion by the late 1970s. The cost to the brand was something that couldn't be calculated on a balance sheet. Firestone had built its reputation on one thing above everything else: safety. For 70 years, the Firestone name on a tire was a promise that the rubber between your car and the road had been made with care, with precision, with the full weight of American manufacturing excellence. The recall destroyed that promise. Not immediately, not completely, but in the way that a crack in a foundation destroys a building, not all at once, but by removing the structural integrity that everything else depends on. Consumers who had bought Firestone their entire lives started asking questions they had never thought to ask before. Are these tires safe? That question, once asked, cannot be unasked. While Firestone was managing the recall, fighting regulators, absorbing the financial losses, and trying to rebuild consumer confidence, something was happening on the other side of the Pacific that the company was not paying sufficient attention to. Bridgestone was coming. Bridgestone had been founded in Japan in 1931 by a man named Shojiro Ishibashi. The name Bridgestone is literally a translation of Ishibashi, which means stone bridge in Japanese. The company had spent the post-war decades building itself into Japan's dominant tire manufacturer, supplying the Japanese automotive industry as it went,
through its own explosive growth. But Bridgestone's leadership had global ambitions, and they had spent years studying the American market from a distance. What they saw was opportunity. They saw an industry where the dominant American players were struggling with a technology transition they hadn't managed cleanly. They saw a market where consumer trust in legacy brands had been damaged by the Firestone 500 disaster. They saw factories operating at 50 to 60% of the productivity levels that Bridgestone's Japanese plants were achieving. They saw a wounded giant. Bridgestone's approach to tires was built on the manufacturing philosophy that had rebuilt Japanese industry after World War II. Relentless process improvement, statistical quality control, the elimination of waste at every stage of production, a belief that defects were not acceptable and that the factory floor should be engineered to make defects structurally impossible rather than caught after the fact. This was not how American tire manufacturing worked. American factories operated on a different philosophy: produce at volume, catch defects at the end of the line, accept a certain failure rate as the cost of doing business at scale. It was a philosophy that had worked for decades because American consumers had no alternative. Once they had an alternative, the difference became visible. Japanese tires, Bridgestone, Yokohama, and others entering the American market through the 1970s and early 1980s, lasted longer, performed more consistently, failed less often. The numbers were not close. American tire companies had spent decades competing against each other, against Goodyear and Goodrich and Uniroyal, companies that all operated from the same industrial base with the same manufacturing assumptions. They had never competed against an industry that had rebuilt itself from zero using better principles. Inside Firestone's factories in Akron, the response to Japanese competition was slow. The company was already staggering under the financial weight of the recall. The capital needed to modernize factories, to tear out aging equipment and replace it with the precision manufacturing systems that could compete with Japanese productivity, was capital Firestone no longer had in abundance. The math was brutal. To compete with Bridgestone, Firestone needed to invest heavily in its manufacturing infrastructure, but the recall had drained the reserves that investment required, and declining market share was reducing the revenue that would fund recovery. The company was caught in a spiral. Every year that Firestone fell further behind in manufacturing quality was a year that more consumers chose a competitor. Every consumer lost reduced the revenue available to close the gap. The gap widened. More consumers left. Under President John Nevin, Firestone attempted a response. It was not a recovery, it was a retreat. 9 manufacturing plants were closed. The corporate headquarters was moved from Akron, where Firestone had been born, where its identity lived, where its workers had built their lives around the company, to Chicago. The closure of those Akron plants was not just a business decision, it was an amputation. Akron had built itself around rubber. Multiple generations of families had worked in Firestone factories. The company and the city were so intertwined that separating them wasn't like removing a piece of the city's identity. Workers who had spent 20 and 30 years on Firestone lines lost jobs that had no equivalent replacement in a city whose entire economic base was built around the same declining industry. The ripple effects moved through neighborhoods, through schools, through local businesses that existed because Firestone workers had money to spend. This was the human cost that the balance sheets didn't show. The plant closures reduced costs. They did not fix the underlying problem. Firestone was still operating factories at productivity levels that couldn't match Japanese competition. It was still carrying brand damage from the recall. It was still losing market share year after year to competitors who were executing better on the factory floor. By the mid-1980s, the conclusion that Firestone's leadership had been resisting was becoming impossible to avoid. The company could not win this fight alone. Conversations began. Pirelli expressed interest. Discussions happened. But in 1988, the deal that defined the end of Firestone as an independent American company was announced. Bridgestone, the Japanese company that had watched Firestone from across the Pacific, that had studied American tire manufacturing and identified its weaknesses, that had built its own operations on the principles that Firestone's factories had failed to adopt, acquired Firestone Tire and Rubber Company for $2.6 billion. $2.6 billion, For the company, Harvey Firestone had started with 12 employees and a dream about rubber and automobiles. The number sounds large. It wasn't. Bridgestone bought Firestone for significantly less than the company had been worth a decade earlier, before the recall, before the losses, before the market share collapse. They bought it at a discount because they were the only buyer willing to take on what Firestone had become. And here is the part of the story that cuts deepest. Bridgestone took Firestone's factories, the same facilities where American workers had been operating at 50 to 60% of Japanese productivity levels, and fixed them. Not by replacing the workers, not by shipping in Japanese labor, by implementing the manufacturing systems and quality control processes that Bridgestone had been using in Japan for years. The same factories, the same American workers, different systems, and the productivity gap closed. By 1992, just 4 years after the acquisition, the combined Bridgestone-Firestone operation was generating surplus profits. 4 years. That is how quickly the manufacturing gap closed, once the right systems were in place. 4 years to turn operations that had been bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars into profitable facilities. This fact is the most uncomfortable part of Firestone's story. The workers weren't the problem. The American factory floor wasn't fundamentally incapable of competing with Japan. The gap wasn't about culture or work ethic or national character. It was about systems, about the decisions made by management about how to run a factory, about the willingness to invest in quality at the process level rather than inspect for defects at the end of the line, about the discipline to do the hard, expensive, unglamorous work of rebuilding manufacturing infrastructure before a crisis made it unavoidable. Firestone's management had known what Japanese tire manufacturers were doing differently. The information wasn't secret. The principles weren't mysterious. They had been documented, studied, and discussed in American manufacturing circles throughout the 1970s. Knowing wasn't enough. Acting on what you know, spending the money, disrupting the operations, accepting the short-term pain of transformation is a different thing entirely from knowing. Firestone knew. It didn't act. And by the time the consequences of inaction became undeniable, the company no longer had the resources to act, even if the will had been there. What happened to Firestone is not simply a story about Japanese competition. It is a story about what happens when a company mistakes its past success for future protection. Firestone had built something genuinely great. The relationship with Ford, the Indianapolis 500, the voice of Firestone, the decades of American roads held up by Akron rubber. These were real achievements, real history, real institutional pride. And that pride became a blindfold. When the radial revolution arrived, Firestone's leadership looked at their history, at 70 years of success, at their dominance of the American market, at Firestone's name on gas stations and service centers from coast to coast, and made the decision that their past success gave them permission to find a cheaper path to the future. It didn't. There are no cheaper paths to fundamental technological transitions. You either make the investment or you fall behind. And when you fall behind in manufacturing, you don't fall behind gradually and gracefully. You fall behind suddenly and completely, because the competitor who made the investment has a compounding advantage that widens every year. Michelin made the radial investment. Bridgestone made the quality systems investment. Goodyear eventually and painfully made the conversion investment. Firestone tried to find the shortcut. The Firestone 500 was the shortcut, and the shortcut killed people, triggered the largest tire recall in history, and began the financial spiral that ended with a Japanese company buying an American institution for a fraction of what it had been worth. By 1992, the name Firestone still existed, the factory still ran, the tires still shipped, but the company behind the name was gone. Akron, Ohio, the rubber capital of the world, was a different city. The plants that had employed generations of families were closed or running under Japanese ownership with Japanese management systems. The civic identity that had been built around rubber and Firestone and Goodyear was fracturing. The jobs that had anchored working-class communities across the city were gone, replaced by nothing comparable. This is the part of the story that business histories tend to move past quickly. The workers. The man who had spent 30 years on a Firestone curing line and lost his job when the plant closed wasn't a line item in a restructuring announcement. He was a person who had built a life around a promise, the promise that if you showed up, did the work, mastered the line, gave the company your years, the company would be there. Firestone wasn't there. The factories that closed in Akron didn't just eliminate jobs, they eliminated a form of life that entire communities had been built around. The working-class neighborhoods near the plants, the local businesses that served the workers, the schools funded by property taxes from factory employment, the social structures that formed around shift work and union membership, and the shared identity of being Firestone people. All of it depended on the factory running. When the factory stopped, everything that had grown around it started dying too. This is what happens when an institution falls. Not just the institution itself, but the ecosystem that had built up around it over decades. The rubber industry's decline in Akron is one of the defining American deindustrialization stories of the late 20th century. It happened in steel towns in Pennsylvania, and auto towns in Michigan, and textile towns in the Carolinas. The details differ, the structure is the same. A company that had been the anchor of a community for generations makes decisions, some bad, some simply unlucky, some the result of forces larger than any single company could control, and the community pays a price that far exceeds what shows up on any corporate balance sheet. Firestone's leadership did not set out to destroy Akron, but the decisions made in boardrooms, the shortcuts taken in factories, the billions lost in recalls and market share and restructuring, all of it eventually arrived at the same address, the factory floor, where the workers were. In 1988, when Bridgestone completed its acquisition, the tire industry that Harvey Firestone had helped build was unrecognizable from what it had been even 15 years earlier. American companies that seemed permanent, Uniroyal, Armstrong, General Tire, were being acquired, merged, or absorbed into global companies.
Conglomerates. Michelin bought Uniroyal Goodrich. Pirelli expanded. The entire industry was consolidating around a small number of global players. The era of the American tire empire was over. Japan hadn't just taken Firestone, it had taken the industry's center of gravity and moved it. Harvey Firestone believed, and he wasn't wrong in his time, that the future of the automobile ran through Akron, Ohio. That the relationships built in those early decades between American manufacturers and American tire companies would define the industry forever. He couldn't have imagined a world where a Japanese company founded by a man who started in the sock business would end up owning the company he built. But that is exactly what happened. And the reason it happened is not complicated, even if the details are. Firestone stopped believing the factory floor was where the future was decided. They believed the future was decided in relationships, in brand reputation, in the Firestone name on the side of the Indianapolis 500, in the decades of goodwill accumulated through the Voice of Firestone and the friendship between Harvey Firestone and Henry Ford. Those things were real, they were valuable, they were not enough. Because on the factory floor in Japan, engineers were building tires to tolerances that Firestone's plants weren't hitting, with processes that Firestone's management hadn't implemented,
with quality systems that caught problems before they became recalls instead of after. The future was being built in the factory. It always is. And Firestone, for a critical decade, was somewhere else. The bottle still exists. The name still survives. Firestone tires are still sold today in Bridgestone's portfolio on American roads. But the empire is gone. The factories in Akron are gone. The workers who built their lives around those lines are gone into other industries or into retirement or into the statistics of deindustrialization that economists study but rarely make human. Harvey Firestone started with 12 employees and a belief that American manufacturing could build the world. He was right. But the world he helped build eventually outgrew the company that built it. And Firestone, the institution, the empire, the American original, learned the hardest lesson industrial history has to teach. What you build can be taken, not by someone stronger, not by someone smarter, but by someone who simply refused to stop improving the factory floor while you were busy protecting the name above the door. That is the story of Firestone, and that is American Factory Stories.